By the year 1259, the Mongol Empire had swallowed the world. From the frozen steppes of Korea to the sun-baked walls of Baghdad, from the forests of Russia to the foothills of the Himalayas. No army on earth had defeated them, not once. Not in 40 years of relentless conquest. They had annihilated the largest Muslim empire in history and barely slowed down. They had erased Baghdad, the crown jewel of Islamic civilization, in a single week, killing somewhere between 200,000 and 1,000,000 people. The Abbasid Caliph himself was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, because Mongol tradition forbade royal blood from touching the earth. Think about what that means. The spiritual leader of the entire Islamic world, a lineage stretching back over 500 years, gone, stamped out under hooves in an afternoon. And now, their armies were turning south, toward Egypt, the last major Muslim power left standing. A nation ruled not by kings or princes, but by former slaves. Men who had been bought as children, trained as weapons, and who had seized a throne that no one expected them to keep. What happened next? In a valley in Palestine called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, would become one of the most important battles ever fought. And almost nobody talks about it. This is the story of how the unstoppable were stopped. To understand what made Ain Jalut so extraordinary, you first need to understand what the world was dealing with. The Mongol war machine was not simply a large army. It was arguably the most sophisticated military force the medieval world had ever produced. Every Mongol warrior grew up in the saddle. They learned to ride before they could walk. They could shoot a bow with devastating accuracy at full gallop. They could cover 70 miles in a single day, a speed that European armies would not match for another 600 years. But their real advantage was not brute force. It was intelligence, and I mean that in both senses of the word. The Mongols operated the most advanced espionage network of the medieval era. Before they invaded any territory, they sent merchants, diplomats, and spies, sometimes years in advance. They knew the political fault lines of their enemies. They knew which generals were competent and which were corrupt. They knew where the grain stores were. They knew the roads. Their army was organized on a strict decimal system. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Every soldier knew exactly who he reported to and exactly what was expected. Discipline was absolute. The penalty for retreating without orders was death, not just for the soldier, but for his entire unit of 10. And their tactics were diabolical. They perfected the feigned retreat, a maneuver that had destroyed more armies than perhaps any other in history. A Mongol force would engage the enemy, appear to panic, and flee. The enemy would give chase, their formations would break apart in the excitement of pursuit, and then the trap would close. Fresh Mongol cavalry would sweep in from the flanks and annihilate them. It worked every single time. Against the Khwarezmians, against the Russians, against the Poles and Hungarians at Mohi and Legnica. Army after army fell for it. Because in the heat of battle, the urge to chase a fleeing enemy is almost impossible to resist. By 1258, the Mongol juggernaut had reached the Middle East in force. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself, commanded an army estimated at over 100,000 warriors. He had already destroyed the assassins in their mountain fortresses. He had obliterated Baghdad. He had taken Aleppo and Damascus. City after city fell or surrendered without a fight. The message Hulagu sent to his enemies was always the same: submit or be destroyed. There is no third option. And the terrifying thing was, it was not a bluff. The Mongols had proven, again and again, that they meant exactly what they said. Cities that surrendered were often spared. Cities that resisted were razed to the foundations, their population slaughtered, their fields salted. As 1260 began, only one major Muslim power remained unconquered: the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. And Hulagu sent them a letter. The Mamluks were, by any measure, one of the strangest ruling classes in human history. The word Mamluk literally means one who is owned. They were slaves. Purchased as boys, mostly Turkic and Circassian children from the steppes of Central Asia and the Caucasus. They were brought to Egypt and subjected to one of the most rigorous military training programs the medieval world had ever devised. They learned horsemanship, archery, sword fighting, lance combat, and military strategy. But they also studied Arabic, the Quran, and Islamic law. They were converted to Islam and given a thorough education. And upon completing their training, they were freed. But here is the crucial detail. Even after being freed, their identity, their brotherhood, their loyalty, remained rooted in their shared experience of slavery and training. They formed a military elite unlike any other. They owed nothing to birth or lineage. Their status was earned through skill, through survival, through the bonds forged in those brutal training camps. In 1250, these former slave soldiers had done the unthinkable. They overthrew the Ayyubid dynasty, the dynasty founded by Saladin himself, and seized power in Egypt. A slave became sultan. By 1259, the man who held power in Cairo was Saif ad-Din Qutuz, and his personal story reads like something out of a myth. Qutuz was born a prince. He was a member of the Khwarezmian royal family, the very dynasty that the Mongols had destroyed decades earlier in one of the most savage campaigns of Genghis Khan's career. As a child, Qutuz had been captured, enslaved, and sold. He was passed from merchant to merchant along the slave routes until he ended up in Egypt, where he was trained as a Mamluk warrior. So when Hulagu's letter arrived in Cairo, a letter demanding that the Mamluks surrender, that they submit, that they acknowledge Mongol supremacy, Qutuz was not reading it as a politician weighing his options. He was reading it as a man whose entire family had been exterminated by the very people now threatening him. The letter was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Hulagu reminded the Mamluks of every nation the Mongols had destroyed. He listed the kings they had killed, the cities they had burned. He told them that resistance was futile, that God himself had granted dominion to the Mongols, and that to oppose them was to oppose the will of heaven. Qutuz's response was extraordinary. He had the Mongol ambassadors arrested, then he had them executed. Their heads were mounted on the gates of Cairo. In the world of medieval diplomacy, killing ambassadors was the most extreme statement imaginable. It was a declaration not just of war, but of defiance unto death. Qutuz was telling Hulagu, and the entire Mongol Empire, that Egypt would not kneel, that the Mamluks would rather be destroyed than submit. But Qutuz was not a fool. Defiance without strategy is just suicide. And he had something the Mongols did not expect: a plan, and a weapon they had never faced. Standing beside Qutuz was a man named Baibars, another Mamluk, another former slave, and one of the most brilliant military commanders of the entire medieval period. Baibars had already fought the Mongols once before, during the chaos of the Seventh Crusade, and he had studied their tactics with obsessive intensity. These two men, the prince-turned-slave-turned-sultan and the orphan-turned-warrior-turned-general, would now attempt what no one in 40 years had managed. They would try to stop the Mongol Empire, and they had one advantage that nobody saw coming. In 1259, something happened that changed everything, and it happened thousands of miles away from Egypt. Möngke Khan, the Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the entire Mongol Empire, died. The circumstances were disputed. Some sources say he fell ill during a campaign in China. Others say he was killed in battle. But the cause mattered less than the consequence. The Mongol Empire plunged into a succession crisis. Möngke's brothers, Kublai and Arik Boke, both claimed the throne. The empire that had functioned as a unified war machine for decades was suddenly fractured by internal politics. And Hulagu, who had been preparing to invade Egypt with his full army, received an urgent message. He needed to return east, not to fight for the throne himself necessarily, but to secure his own lands and position in the coming power struggle. Hulagu withdrew the bulk of his forces from the Levant. He left behind a garrison force under the command of his general Kitbuqa Noyan, a seasoned commander and a Nestorian Christian, incidentally, which would become significant in the diplomacy surrounding the battle. The force Kitbuqa commanded was still formidable. Estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 warriors. These were veteran Mongol cavalry, supplemented by local auxiliaries from conquered Armenian and Georgian kingdoms. But it was a fraction of the army that had sacked Baghdad, a fraction of the army that had been meant to conquer Egypt. Qutuz recognized this instantly. This was the window. Not a wide one, not a comfortable one, but a window nonetheless. He moved fast. He assembled the Mamluk army, approximately 20,000 horsemen, though some sources suggest slightly more. He forged an extraordinary alliance with a Mamluk faction led by Baibars that had previously been his rival. Internal disputes were set aside. The existential threat demanded unity. And then Qutuz made a decision that shocked his advisors. He would not wait for the Mongols to come to Egypt. He would march out and meet them. He would take the fight to Palestine. This was audacious. Every other power that had faced the Mongols had fought defensively, behind walls, behind rivers, on their own territory. And every one of them had lost. Qutuz understood, perhaps intuitively, that defense against the Mongols was a losing strategy. Their feigned retreats, their flanking maneuvers, their ability to dictate the terms of engagement, all of these advantages were amplified when they were the ones attacking. But there was another reason for marching north, a diplomatic one, and it involved the most unlikely allies imaginable: the Crusader states. The remnants of the Crusader kingdoms still clung to a thin strip of the Palestinian and Syrian coast. And Qutuz sent them a message: "Let us pass through your territory. We are going to fight the Mongols. Stay out of our way, and we will not touch you." The Crusaders, led at that point by the remnants of the Kingdom of Acre, agreed. Some of them even provided supplies and intelligence on Mongol positions. It was a pragmatic decision. The Mongols were a threat to everyone. But it was also a remarkable moment. Muslim and Christian, enemies for nearly 2 centuries, cooperating against a greater threat. By early September 1260, the Mamluk army had crossed the Sinai, passed through Crusader territory, and reached the Jezreel Valley in northern Palestine. Scouts reported that Kitbuqa's forces were nearby. The two armies were about to collide in a valley called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, the place where, according to tradition, the young David had slain the giant. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The morning of September 3rd, 1260, the Jezreel Valley, a wide open plain ringed by hills, and this geography would prove decisive. Qutuz and Baibars had studied Mongol tactics. They knew about the feigned retreat. They knew about the flanking maneuvers. They knew that Mongol armies use speed and deception to fragment enemy formations and destroy them piecemeal. And they built their entire battle plan around turning those tactics against the Mongols themselves. Baibars commanded the vanguard, a relatively small advance force. His job was perhaps the most dangerous assignment any commander could receive. He was the bait. Baibars rode out with his detachment and engaged the Mongol scouts and forward units. The fighting was fierce, but calculated. Baibars pressed the attack just hard enough to draw attention, then pulled back. He was performing the Mongols' own maneuver against them, a feigned retreat. Kitbuqa took the bait. He saw a smaller Mamluk force apparently breaking under pressure, and he ordered a full pursuit. The Mongol cavalry surged forward into the valley, following the retreating Mamluks deeper and deeper into the plain. And then the trap closed. Qutuz had hidden the main body of the Mamluk army in the hills surrounding the valley. As the Mongols charged into the center of the plain, committed and extended, Mamluk cavalry erupted from both flanks. Thousands of fresh horsemen smashing into the sides of the Mongol formation. The Mongols were caught in a classic envelopment. The very tactic they had used to annihilate armies from China to Hungary was now being used against them. And for the first time, they could not escape it. The fighting was savage. The Mongols were elite warriors, and they did not break easily. Kitbuqa, to his credit, fought with extraordinary courage. He rallied his men again and again, and at several points the Mongols nearly managed to break through the Mamluk encirclement. There was a moment, and multiple sources confirmed this, when the Mamluk left flank buckled. The Mongols, fighting with the desperation of men who knew what defeat meant, drove a wedge into the Mamluk line. For a brief, terrible moment, the battle hung in the balance. And this is where Qutuz earned his place in history. When the Mamluk line wavered, Qutuz threw off his helmet so that his soldiers could see his face. He rode directly into the collapsing flank, screaming, and the Arabic sources record his exact words, "Wa Islama!" "Oh my Islam!" A cry of desperation and faith and fury all at once. He charged into the Mongol line personally, the Sultan of Egypt riding into the teeth of the most feared cavalry on earth. And his soldiers, seeing their Sultan fighting in the front rank, surged forward after him. The Mamluk line held. Then, it pushed forward. The Mongols began to give ground. Kitbuqa refused to retreat. Whether out of loyalty, pride, or the knowledge that the Mongol penalty for unauthorized retreat was death, he fought on even as his army disintegrated around him. He was eventually unhorsed, surrounded, and captured. Some accounts say he was killed in the fighting itself. Others say he was brought before Qutuz and executed. In one famous account, when Kitbuqa was brought before the Mamluk Sultan, he remained defiant. He warned Qutuz that the Mongols would return, that an ocean of warriors would come to avenge this defeat. Qutuz reportedly stared him in the eye and ordered his execution. By the afternoon of September 3rd, 1260, it was over. The Mongol army in the Levant had been destroyed. Not just defeated, destroyed. The remnants fled eastward in disarray, for the first time in nearly half a century of conquest, from China to Poland, from Persia to Iraq. A Mongol army had been decisively beaten in open battle. The invincible were no longer invincible. In the days following Ain Jalut, the Mamluks swept through Syria. Damascus was liberated. Aleppo was retaken. The Mongol garrison forces, demoralized and leaderless, crumbled. Within weeks, the Mongols had been pushed back beyond the Euphrates. The entire Levant, the lands that Hulagu had spent years conquering, was lost in a matter of days. But the aftermath held one more twist. And it was brutal. Less than a month after the battle, on the march back to Egypt, Sultan Qutuz was assassinated, murdered by conspirators within his own ranks. And the man who emerged as the new sultan was none other than Baibars, the general who had commanded the vanguard at Ain Jalut, the man who had served as the bait that lured the Mongols into the trap. Whether Baibars personally orchestrated the killing or simply seized the opportunity remains debated by historians. But the result was the same. The hero of Ain Jalut was dead within weeks of his greatest victory, and the man who replaced him would go on to become one of the most powerful sultans in Egyptian history, consolidating Mamluk power across the region for decades. The irony is staggering. Qutuz saved the Islamic world from annihilation, and his reward was a knife in the back from his own side. But the significance of Ain Jalut extends far beyond the personal fates of its commanders. This battle redrew the map of the world. The Mongol Empire, which had seemed destined to conquer everything from the Pacific to the Atlantic, had reached its western limit. They would raid into Syria again, but they would never conquer it. They would never take Egypt. The Mamluk Sultanate would endure for another 2.5 centuries. And the psychological impact was seismic. For 40 years, the Mongols had operated under an aura of invincibility. Every army they faced fought not just against superior tactics, but against the crushing belief that the Mongols could not be beaten. Ain Jalut shattered that myth. It proved that the Mongols were men, not gods. That they could be outmaneuvered, outfought, and destroyed. This gave hope, and a tactical blueprint, to every power that would resist them in the decades to come. History is full of battles that decided the fate of nations, but only a handful decided the fate of civilizations. Ain Jalut is one of them. If the Mamluks had lost, if Qutuz had not thrown his helmet off and charged, if Baibars had not held the bait long enough, if the flanking forces had been spotted too early, the Mongol Empire would have swept into Egypt and North Africa. The entire Islamic heartland would have fallen. The cultural, scientific, and religious trajectory of the world would have been fundamentally, irreversibly altered. Instead, a group of former slaves, men who had been bought and sold as children, who had been trained as weapons and discarded as people, stood in a valley named after a giant killer and proved that the greatest empire the world had ever seen could bleed. Sometimes, history turns not on the actions of the powerful, but on the defiance of those who were never meant to have power at all. If this story gripped you, hit subscribe and the notification bell, because the stories we cover on this channel are the ones that history forgot to make famous. Drop a comment and tell me, did you know about the Battle of Ain Jalut before this video? And which forgotten battle should we cover next? I will see you in the next one.